Some beautiful black man would come through the neighborhood dressed in African shit, really nice shit, and they'd be, peace, love, black is beautiful. Remember the essence of life. We are people of the universe, and life is beautiful. My parents go, that nigga crazy.
You know what I've decided to do? I'm going to do missionary work. Probably be going to Africa. I'll be doing work among your people. Not mine, my people in St. Louis.
Yeah, there is no African blood, there is no African genetics, there is no African nationality, there is no monolithic African tribe.
I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia.
Let's just jump straight into this. Listen, Pan-Africans, you have to study. You are not studying. Let me show you what types of information you need to study. The people who enslaved your ancestors know who you are. They are not laughing at Ali when he comes and says, we've been here.
So we're going to deal with some history, we're going to deal with law. Understand that law and history goes together. Law and history goes together. All scholars know this fact.
Aborigines, which means what? Black folks. You never find a white aborigine. Rather, aborigines natives, they're always dark-skinned people. You and I are aborigines, but you don't have to be called an aborigine.
I'm talking for the natives.
Yeah.
I like when it comes to talking about African Americans, I have no education with that. Period. I don't. I'm not even connecting to that no more because that's a system. That's like connecting. Say, hey, he's a bad guy. You don't hang with him. Oh, hey, I'm gonna find out for myself. I'm not African American at all. My folks is not from Africa, and a lot of people in this room, folks ain't from Africa. Might be a couple, but people just don't understand. I asked my grandma, like, yo, grandma, what's your background? She like, Redfoot and Blacktail Indian. What? Yeah, my mother and my father did. We 100% Indians. Ask my other grandma, we got Cherokee in us, and European and Italian, a little Dominican. It's crazy. I'm like, what the fuck? That's why I'm going to Africa. Y'all look at me funny, like, nigga, I'm African. Like, you're not though. Like, you're not. 80% of slaves was already here. It was natives.
Okay, this book is called Native American Almanac. More than 50,000 years of cultures and histories of the indigenous people. Wrote by Yvonne Dennis. Okay, I'm going to start reading at page 100, the highlighted part of this paragraph. It was more economical than important Africans. Native people already knew how to work the local land. They were cheaper to buy as they didn't have to be transported across the sea. And native people could capture and sell peoples from other tribes for revenge as well as trading captives for coveted European-made items, especially guns. Women were especially sought after as they were superior farmers and used to hard work. Countless groups were destroyed by the settlers' colonial practice of slavery. Some survivors were assimilated into remaining tribes. Now they saying plain as day in this paragraph, they didn't have to go to Africa to get no slaves. They used the indigenous people.
Sold American. So, Mr. Speck, how much for a young Django here? Sold American. So, Mr. Speck, how much for a young Django here? Sold American. So, Mr. Speck, how much for a young Django here?
And what you gonna say now? She says she's not African. She's definitely a Cherokee Indian.
And Creek.
Me too. I'm Black Attar.
Nah, come on.
I'm sure. Do you see that fine sister right there? I'm Black Attar.
So you saying that she could take you off your square, man?
Got me. You got me, sister.
So no, serious. She is, brother.
Yeah, my grandmother is Cherokee, and my father's side is Creek.
See?
We're from Madison, Georgia.
Based off of what though?
Based off of, we can show you. We can prove it. I got pictures at home and the whole nine.
So how's that?
We're going to talk about indigenous peoples' rights.
the case that we're going to focus on is the second of three cases decided by the Marshall Court in the early 19th century. The first of these cases, which is the subject of a different lecture, is Johnson versus McIntosh, decided in 1823. The second, and the one we're going to focus on now, is Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, decided in 1831. And the last is Worcester versus Georgia, decided in 1832, which will also be the subject of a separate lecture. Johnson versus McIntosh is important for present purposes for having established in American law something called the Discovery Doctrine. The case involved a land claim, a late British colonial era land claim. The land speculators lost, and part of the reason they lost, the court said, was that the tribes had nothing that they could sell to them because of the Discovery Doctrine. And this doctrine provided, as expressed in Johnson versus McIntosh, that upon discovery of the New World, the underlying title, fee title or radical title, some say, to all discovered lands vested instantly and automatically in the discovering European sovereign. So ownership of discovered lands, of the title to discovered lands, vested in the discovering European sovereign by operation of law in some sense. What remained to the tribes, to the indigenous peoples, was an occupancy right, later construed to mean essentially a right to occupy those lands and other things. And that occupancy right was alienable, could be transferred, given, or sold, but only to the same discovering sovereign, or someone who had that sovereign's permission to acquire it. Now, that rule was, I suggested in the other lecture and have said elsewhere, I believe to have been established in order to resolve a dispute unrelated to the Johnson versus McIntosh dispute, which was a dispute involving title to lands claimed by Virginia militia, Revolutionary War militia veterans, lands in southwestern, claimed by these militia veterans to lands in southwestern Kentucky. That dispute disappeared after Johnson, and I think that John Marshall probably thought that the Discovery Doctrine would cease to have any real meaning, and it turned out he was wrong. And it turned out very quickly that he was really wrong. And it's important to understand Johnson versus McIntosh because it's Johnson that made possible the following two cases in the Marshall Trilogy, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia and Worcester versus Georgia. So how does Georgia get into this? Well, in 1802, Georgia had ceded its western land claims to the United States. This was something that Virginia had done earlier and North Carolina had done earlier and other states had as well. Georgia had charter claims, claims under British charters to the lands that became Mississippi and Alabama. And in 1802, Georgia finally said, okay, all right, all of those, whatever claims we have, whatever interest we have in those lands under these British charters, we're now transferring to the United States. And the U.S. established then territorial governments over those lands that were superintended by Congress. Now, Georgia's condition was that the U.S. would use its treaty power under the Constitution to come down to Georgia and make a deal with the tribal governments whose lands were within the claimed state limits of Georgia, under which those tribes would leave, would cede those lands up in treaties. They would then become the property of Georgia. Georgia could distribute them to Georgians, and the integrity of the state would be achieved. The tribes, Georgians weren't particularly interested in where they went. They could go west somewhere. 1802 wasn't clear. It became clearer after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 that, oh yeah, well the federal government has lots of land or access to lots of land way out west. Maybe the tribes will trade lands in Georgia for lands out out in the West. And the United States started to negotiate these treaties in satisfaction of its obligations under the 1802 Georgia Cession. The Muskogee Creeks eventually sort of agreed to move a little west. But the Cherokees didn't. The Cherokees, whose lands were in northwestern Georgia, said, we're going to stay. And the United States said, okay. And every few years, a Georgia delegation would show up in Washington, and whoever happened to be president would be asked, well, what about, Cherokees and 1802 and stuff? And the president would say, oh yeah, we talked to them and they don't want to go. And we're not going to declare a war on them to force them to go. We'll go back and ask, give it a few years. But the Cherokees became less and less inclined to leave as time passed, or so it appeared. Adopting a constitution, Sequoyah creates the syllabary. The nation becomes perhaps the most literate nation in the world at the time, almost overnight. A newspaper is established, a form of government as a legislative body and a judicial body, etc. And then gold is discovered in the Cherokee Nation. So they're never going to leave.
It's Indian territories, tribes. Like, people be thinking Indians with the Pocahontas looking. That ain't how Indians look. They look like them people in New Orleans. Louisiana, all over Louisiana. Them Indians, tribes. It's Indian territories, tribes. Like, people be thinking Indians with the Pocahontas looking. That ain't how Indians look. They look like them people in New Orleans. Louisiana, all over Louisiana. Them Indians, tribes.
My boy stand on the Magnolia Bridge. Playboy hollering, don't worry. So them uptown Indians got low down ways. Boy, they jumping in glory, talking about hey. Let's buy up on a huna, hey. But he wants Pantula, hey. Let me Giacomo Pino, under the morning. Giacomo Pino, under the morning. Giacomo Pino, under the morning. I'ma tell you something, boy, you don't know. Early Mardi Gras morning. So them Indians jumping on the battlefield, strike without no warning, talking about hey. They tell your mama now, hey. They tell your papa now, hey. Let me Giacomo Pino under the morning, Giacomo Pino under the morning, Giacomo Pino under the morning. Let my boy eat the pork chop, your my boy eat liver. Mardi Gras morning when the Indians come, gonna run you dead in the river, talking about hey. They bomb bumbola, hey. Let them Indian ruler now, hey. Hey, Giacomo Pino under the morning, Giacomo Pino under the morning, Giacomo Pino under the morning. That big chief eagle from way uptown.
What do you mean by America's my mama?
I don't know nothing else. I wasn't eating chitlins when I was in Africa. I wasn't eating watermelon when I was in Africa. I wasn't wearing zoot suits when I was in Africa. I wasn't getting my hair cut when I was in Africa. This bitch is my mama. And yours too. Except I know it's mine.